You don't have to visit a fairy tale to see gorgeous towns like this. You just have to visit Germany. These towns look so beautiful, it's as if they existed in a fairy tale dream. Join me as we take a look at 15 of the most gorgeous European fairy tale towns. Number 15. Kitzbuhel, Austria. Located on the Kitzbühel-Acker River in the central eastern Alps in Austria is the small medieval town of Kitzbühel, which is probably best known in modern times as a premier ski destination, but also looks as if it's leaped straight out of the pages of a fairy tale book. The earliest signs of people living in the region date as far back as 3,000 years ago and was also ruled by the Roman Empire during its expansion across the Alps. But it was in the 13th century when the small town became a part of Upper Bavaria that it underwent a period of expansion. At that time, defensive walls were built, and over the following centuries, Gothic architecture became one of its defining features. Due to its remote location, Kitzbühel avoided the wars that ravaged nearby regions, and this meant that many ancient buildings were able to survive, and newly built structures were done so in the same style. On particular note was St. Catherine's Church, which was built in the mid-12th century, as well as Christ Church, which was built in 1962, and the Dance Café, which was built in 1928. Despite being a mixture of old and new, there are now strict rules on the outer facades of all structures that must incorporate locally sourced materials and feature wooden roofs and pastel-colored exteriors. Number 14. Gruyere, Switzerland. Probably most known for being the place where the cheese comes from, the Swiss town of Gruyere is steeped in history, and with quaint buildings and more than 800-year-old castle, you'll feel as if there's a mystery to be uncovered around every corner. Built atop a hill that overlooks the San River Valley, there's always a population of 1,000 or 2,000 people who mainly rely on agriculture. Ruins of a nearby Roman villa, as well as Iron Age grave sites, show that people have lived there for a long time. But it was when the castle was first built in the late 12th century to control the valley below that the village became established. With a need for workers to support the castle, Gruyere began to develop in its shadows, and it soon became a vibrant market town. And this can be seen to this day in all directions, with houses and buildings still in line with the traditional architectural designs. Having seen numerous rulers and counts over the years, all of whom were recorded in the archives of the castle, this is surely the kind of place you'd expect to stop at for a meal while you're on your way to rescue a princess. Number 13. Rothenburg, Germany. The incredible town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber is in Bavaria in Germany, and it's one of the best preserved medieval old towns in the country. It's also one of the only 3 that still have their historical city walls and relies so heavily on tourism because of its unique setting that it's part of Germany's romantic road theme route, which itself is based on the original trade route through the region. Originally founded in 1170 to support the newly built Stauffer Castle, parts of the original development can still be seen today. It was soon declared a free imperial city, which allowed the rulers of the town to operate independently from the wider country. And even though large parts were destroyed by an earthquake in 1356, most of it was rebuilt. There was a similar reconstruction period following the Second World War, during which almost half of the town was destroyed, but all structures were designed to replicate, or at least in the same style as the original designs, which is why it still retains its medieval vibe today. Undoubtedly feeling like a fairy tale town, Rothenburg boasts a pedigree like no other. This was the town that served as the inspiration for the setting of Disney's 1940 movie Pinocchio, and it was also used as a location in the final 2 Harry Potter movies. Number 12. Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina. The city of Mostar is the 5th biggest in Bosnia and Herzegovina and lies on the picturesque Neretva River that runs through it. From the first moment you see the old bridge that crosses the waterway, you can tell that this is a special place, and one that almost seems like time forgot. The bridge itself was built by the Ottomans in the 16th century and is a stunning example of Islamic architecture from the time. Once described as being like a rainbow soaring up into the skies, it's the most visited and recognizable landmark of the city. But unfortunately, the one that's there isn't actually the original. It did stand for more than 400 years and would be there today if it wasn't for its destruction by the Croatian Defense Council in the 1990s during the Bosnian War. A replica was built in 2005 though, which was a faithful recreation and made with exactly the same materials and to the same specifications as the original. There are plenty of other historic monuments in the city too though, that have stood the test of time. There are the remains of a Christian basilica, a clock tower, a more than 130-year-old synagogue, a lavish palace, and a mosque from the 16th century that completes the historical feel to Mostar and has a vista that would be at home on the cover of a storybook. Number 11. Eguisheim, France. Located within the Alsace region of northeastern France, the small commune of Eguisheim is exactly what you'd expect from a medieval encampment in the country. Surrounded by vineyards and often voted as one of the most beautiful villages in France, a castle was first built there in the 11th century, and other buildings to support it soon followed. Arranged in concentric circles around the castle, the streets are paved with cobbles and lined with brightly colored houses with traditional pointed roofs and timber frame construction. There are still the fountains and courtyards that were installed hundreds of years ago, and a small church that had its original 13th century opening virgin. Walking through the town, you'll feel the whispers of the past all around you and stumble upon hidden messages and codes that have been etched into the wooden frames of the buildings. Whether these are examples of medieval graffiti or ancient riddles, no one can be sure, but it does add to the mystique of the place. While the town is fairy tale-like throughout the year, it truly comes into its own around Christmas time when it's covered in snow and lit up with the annual decorations. The rustic charm and architecture mean you'll almost be certain that the brothers Grimm must have passed through and seen it for themselves at some point. Number 10. Bled, Slovenia. Set on the side of a glacial lake which freezes all the way over each winter, Bled is a medieval town in northwestern Slovenia and one of the most picturesque places in the whole country. Despite there being a human presence there for centuries, the town as it is today began taking shape in the 19th century and has become an idyllic mountain refuge. From Bled Castle, which dates back to more than 1,000 years and still stands on a precipice overlooking the lake, to the small island at the center of the lake which is home to the Assumption of Mary Pilgrimage Church. Not only does the town attract tourists from far and wide because of its stunning architecture and historical importance, but also because the pure waters have led it to becoming known as a wellness resort town. There's a thermal spring that feeds 2 of the resort's swimming pools, but the lake itself reaches warm enough levels to swim in during the summer. In winter, though, the lake brings the focus back to Bled's fairy tale-like qualities, because as it becomes covered in ice, it's used for skating. It also means that the island's accessible by foot, rather than being forced to row there by a wooden boat. Number 9. Ghent, Belgium. Situated in the Flemish region of Belgium, Ghent is the 3rd largest city in the country, and while you certainly could spend your entire time there in the more modern outer suburbs, the old town part of the city stays true to its historical roots. It's actually been a region inhabited by people since the Stone Age and Iron Age, but despite it being used by the Romans, Ghent itself first began to develop in 650 with the construction of 2 abbeys, which can still be visited today. Rapid expansion during the 11th century saw it become larger than Cologne and Moscow by the 13th century, with more than 65,000 residents within the city walls, and the towers that the St. Bavo Cathedral and St. Nicholas's Church were built around that time. These and the Gravenstein Castle set the scene for Ghent's beauty and are complemented by other medieval buildings in the old town, which truly make you feel as if you step back through time as you explore the twists and turns of the car-free streets. If you ever visit, there's no bad time to be in Ghent, but truly to savor its charm, choose a time when one of the city's many festivals is taking place. It's for these that the buildings are dressed and return to their former glory. Number 8. Positano, Italy. The Amalfi Coast in Italy has been inspiring people for thousands of years, with evidence of communities dating back to prehistoric times. The region is dotted with small encampments and towns, but perhaps the most impressive is the village of Positano. It's within an enclave in the hills and leads down towards the coastline, and it's the way that all the multicolored buildings sit across the landscape that makes it such a picture-perfect place. There are a number of archaeological sites of Roman ruins, but it's the buildings left over from the village's heyday between the 15th and 17th centuries that have left their mark and given it such a special feeling. During this time, it became a market port built around the church of Santa Maria Assunta, where there's a 13th century Byzantine depiction of the Madonna that was, according to legend, stolen by sailors who experienced such a terrible weather condition that they were forced to give their prize to the villagers of Positano as they passed by. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the town became a small, poor fishing village, but retained its quaint charm. Its resurgence as a tourist destination is thanks in part to author John Steinbeck, who wrote in 1953 that it's a dream place that isn't quite real when you're there and becomes beckoningly real after you've gone. Number 7. Sintra, Portugal. Nestled within the hills of the Serra de Sintra and surrounded by a thick and majestic pine forest, Sintra in Portugal gives off fairy tale vibes as soon as you see the colorfully painted National Palace of Penal looking down from a hilltop. But this is neither the town's only palace nor the most spectacular view on offer. That's because the town has for a long time been the preferred retreat for the Portuguese royalty, and as such has a number of unique palaces and villas, the most impressive of which surely has to be the Quinta da Regalera, a romantic palace that was built in the 19th century and is surrounded by gardens that contain lakes, fountains, grottos, and follies, and is covered throughout with mystic symbols. It's the Palacio Nacional de Sintra that was the town's original palace, though, with elements still remaining from when it was first built in the 15th century. Its two conical chimneys have become icons in their own right, and the building is regarded as one of the best preserved palaces in all of Portugal, something that earned it a place on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It is also perhaps no surprise that Sintra now relies heavily on tourism, and with another 2 palaces, several castles, and even further stately homes and residences, it's a great place to see romantic architecture with flamboyant and decorative buildings in all directions. Number 6. Český Krumlov, Czech Republic. Found within the southern Bohemian region of the Czech Republic, the town of Český Krumlov offers some of the greatest examples of Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque architecture in the whole of Europe. The oldest settlement in the area actually dates back to the Iron Age, as it's on an extremely useful position by a river, and it used to be an important stop off a trade route through the region. The biggest landmark is the Český Krumlov Castle, which was built in the mid-13th century, and following continual building in the time since, now forms one of the largest castle complexes in Central Europe. Covering an area of around 17 acres, the site now features more than 40 palaces and buildings, which are arranged around 5 castle courts and a park. And as you'd expect from a medieval castle, there's a moat around the whole place. But instead of being filled with water, it was designed to be a home to a large number of bears. Inside the castle, the theater has been perfectly preserved, as it was when it first hosted performances in the 17th century, and there are a number of other features and buildings that harken back to life in that time period, making the town a true fairy tale wonder. Number 5. Hallstatt, Austria. Despite there being archaeological evidence linking the area with the Iron Age, the town of Hallstatt in Austria is inextricably linked with medieval times because of the architecture on display and its undeniably picturesque surroundings. It's in the Gmunden district of the country, with the steep slopes of the Dachstein mountain massif to one side and the shores of Lake Hallstatt to the other. For a long time, the only way to access the town was by boat, something that changed in 1890 with the construction of a road. But the residents held firmly onto the notion that the character of the place wouldn't be affected by the influx of new people. Because of its historical importance and because of the scenic surroundings, Hallstatt was recognized as a heritage site by UNESCO in 1997 and has since seen tourist numbers skyrocket. The largest proportion of these new visitors are from China, where Hallstatt was said to be the most Instagrammable place in the world. Rumors also spread that it was the inspiration for the village of Arendelle in Disney's Frozen, and that has led to there being as many as 30,000 tourists a day, despite there only being a permanent population of less than 1,000. Amazingly, Hallstatt is seen as such a beautiful place that a replica has actually been built in China, which is now its official twin town. Number 4. Colmar, France. Another French town that's famous for its wine and its picturesque architecture is Colmar, which is in northeastern France. First mentioned as being a town as long ago as the year 884, it's undergone a series of changes in the time since, after being ruled by the French, the Germans, and for a time the Swedish military, and it was able to avoid much destruction during the French revolutions and the World Wars. This means it's now a gloriously preserved medieval village, particularly in the Old Town, with countless structures that were first built between the 13th and 18th centuries. There are a number of different architectural styles on display here, along with 19th century fountains, various statues, and other monuments. And most of the buildings are painted in bold colors and retain their traditional wooden beams. You could easily walk around Colmar and believe that people who built it were inspired by fairy tales, but the truth is, it's the opposite thing that happened. It's cited as the inspiration behind the design seen in Howl's Moving Castle, an animated Japanese movie that was released in 2004 and has gone on to be featured in several other Japanese works too. Number 3. Giethoorn, the Netherlands. Venice is by far the most famous place in the world where residents use canals instead of roads to travel, but it's by no means the only place. And there's a town in the Netherlands that's far more beautiful and looks just like a setting from a fantasy tale. Called Giethoorn, it's become known as the Venice of the North, or the Dutch Venice, where in the old village the only way to move between buildings was by boat, and it was only relatively recently that even a bicycle path was added. Despite having a population of fewer than 3,000 people, Giethoorn has 176 wooden bridges across the waterways, each of which were dug by hand, along with a series of lakes in the natural peatland that was there before. The reason for doing this was that the villagers were peat farmers, so by creating their ideal home, they were also removing the material they needed to sell elsewhere, and this left a vast network of ponds, lakes, islands, reed beds, and forests. Even today, with more modern buildings, the town is virtually entirely a pedestrian district if you choose to stay on dry land, but it's by boat that you'll get the best vantage point of the 18th and 19th century thatched farmhouses. Number 2. Bibury, England. England has a large number of quaint little rural towns that have been the inspiration for locals in stories such as Lord of the Rings and Alice in Wonderland. But of all of them, the one that's considered to be the most beautiful and then attracts the most visitors purely because of its photogenic qualities is Bibury. Built along the River Colne in the Cotswolds, the stone houses with pitched roofs were mainly built during the 17th century. The honey-colored buildings were used by weavers and were specifically designed in a way to allow the wool to be hung and dried before being processed and then taken to market. No matter where you look in Bibury, you'll find historical buildings and evidence of a thriving market town, such as the largest building, Bibury Court, which was constructed in 1633. The most famous part, though, which attracts people from as far as Japan, is Arlington Row, where the cottages were first built in the 12th century as a wool store and repurposed in the 17th century as homes for the weavers. This is one of the most photographed views in the region, featured on the British passport, and when you're having that cup of tea, you'll almost be convinced you've seen a few hobbits running off into the undergrowth. Number 1. Mittenwald, Germany. As the country where most classic fairy tales were either written or set, it makes sense that Germany has more than its fair share of dreamy towns. But the one that stands out above the rest is Mittenwald, which lies on the border with Austria. With cobbled streets and stunning mountainous views, this was once a vibrant trade center where the merchants would stop off on their way to Venice. Its heyday was during the 16th to 18th centuries. At a time, it also became synonymous with the manufacture of violins, violas, and cellos. But today, it's the fairy tale setting that's the biggest draw for tourists. Seemingly frozen in time more than 200 years ago, Mittenwald's old town still has a babbling brook rippling through its center, with beautifully painted facades, called Luftmalerei, adorning each building front. What would otherwise be a fairly boring town is brought to life by these artistic accents. Many of them tell a story, such as the profession of the former house owners or tales of festivals and events that took place in the town. With further historical buildings like churches and workhouses, and being within driving distance of some of Germany's most famous castles, you can imagine all of the most famous fairy tale characters walking through these streets. And it almost certainly was the inspiration for a number of stories that were published by the Brothers Grimm.
Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.